Jailbird by Kurt Vonnegut, Part 1, Prologue and Chapters 1 and 2, read by Ron Gabaldon.
For Benjamin D. Hitz, close friend of my youth, best man at my wedding. Ben, you used to tell me about wonderful books you had just read, and then I would imagine that I had read them too. You read nothing but the best, Ben, while I studied chemistry. Long time no see. Prologue. Yes, Kilgore Trout is back again. He could not make it on the outside. That is no disgrace. A lot of good people can't make it on the outside. I received a letter this morning, November 16, 1978, from a young stranger named John Figler of Crown Point, Indiana. Crown Point is notorious for a jailbreak there by the bank robber John Dillinger during the depths of the Great Depression. Dillinger escaped by threatening his jailer with a pistol made of soap and shoe polish. His jailer was a woman. God rest his soul, and her soul too. Dillinger was the Robin Hood of my early youth. He is buried near my parents and near my sister Alice, who admired him even more than I did, in Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. Also in there, on the top of Crown Hill, the highest point in the city, is James Whitcomb Riley, the Hoosier poet. When my mother was little, she knew Riley well. Dillinger was summarily executed by agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was shot down in a public place, although he was not trying to escape or resist arrest. So there is nothing recent in my lack of respect for the FBI. John Figler is a law-abiding high school student. He says in his letter that he has read almost everything of mine and is now prepared to state the single idea that lies at the core of my life's work so far. The words are his. Love may fail, but courtesy will prevail. This seems true to me, and complete. So I am now in the abashed condition, 5 days after my 56th birthday, of realizing that I needn't have bothered to write several books. A 7-word telegram would have done the job. Seriously. But young Figler's insight reached me too late. I had nearly finished another book. This one. In it is a minor character, Kenneth Whistler, inspired by an Indianapolis man of my father's generation. The inspirer's name was Powers Hapgood, 1900 to 1949. He is sometimes mentioned in histories of American labor for his deeds of daring do in strikes and at the protests about the executions of Sacco and Vanzetti, and so on. I met him only once. I had lunch with him and my father and my uncle Alex, my father's younger brother, in Stegemeyer's restaurant in downtown Indianapolis after I came home from the European part of World War II. That was in July of 1945. The first atomic bomb had not yet been dropped on Japan. That would happen in about a month. Imagine that. I was 22 and still in uniform, a private first class who had flunked out of Cornell University as a student of chemistry before going to war. My prospects did not look good. There was no family business to go into. My father's architecture firm was defunct. He was broke. I had just gotten engaged to be married anyway, thinking, who but a wife would sleep with me? My mother, as I said ad nauseum in other books, had declined to go on living, since she could no longer be what she had been at the time of her marriage, one of the richest women in town. It was Uncle Alex who had arranged the lunch. He and Powers Hapgood had been at Harvard together. Harvard is all through this book, although I myself never went there. I have since taught there briefly and without distinction, while my own home was going to pieces. I confided that to one of my students, that my home was going to pieces, to which he made this reply. It shows. Uncle Alex was so conservative politically that I do not think he would have eaten lunch with Hapgood gladly if Hapgood had not been a fellow Harvard man. Hapgood was then a labor union officer, a vice president of the local CIO. His wife Mary had been the Socialist Party's candidate for vice president of the United States again and again. In fact, the first time I voted in a national election, I voted for Norman Thomas and Mary Hapgood, not even knowing that she was an Indianapolis person. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman won. I imagined that I was a socialist. I believed that socialism would be good for the common man. As a private first class in the infantry, I was surely a common man. The meeting with Hapgood came about because I had told Uncle Alex that I might try to get a job with a labor union after the Army let me go. Unions were admirable instruments for extorting something like economic justice from employers then. Uncle Alex must have thought something like this: God help us. Against stupidity even the gods contend in vain. Well, at least there is a Harvard man with whom he can discuss this ridiculous dream. It was Schiller who first said that about stupidity and the gods. This was Nietzsche's reply. Against boredom, even the gods contend in vain. So Uncle Alex and I sat down at a front table in Stegemeyer's and ordered beers and waited for Father and Hapgood to arrive. They would be coming separately. If they had come together, they would have had nothing to say to each other on the way. Father by then had lost all interest in politics and history and economics and such things. He had taken to saying that people talked too much. Sensations meant more to him than ideas, especially the feel of natural material at his fingertips. When he was dying about 20 years later, he would say that he wished he had been a potter, making mud pies all day long. To me that was sad, because he was so well educated. It seemed to me that he was throwing his knowledge and intelligence away, just as a retreating soldier might throw away his rifle and pack. Other people found it beautiful. He was a much beloved man in the city, with wonderfully talented hands. He was invariably courteous and innocent. To him, all craftsmen were saints, no matter how mean or stupid they might really be. Uncle Alex, by the way, could do nothing with his hands. Neither could my mother. She could not even cook a breakfast or sew on a button. Powers Hapgood could mine coal. That's what he did after he graduated from Harvard, when his classmates were taking jobs in family businesses and brokerages and banks and so on. He mined coal. He believed that a true friend of the working people should be a worker himself, and a good one too. So I have to say that my father, when I got to know him, when I myself was something like an adult, was a good man in full retreat from life. My mother had already surrendered and vanished from our table of organization, so an air of defeat has always been a companion of mine. So I have always been enchanted by brave veterans like Powers Hapgood and some others who were still eager for information of what was really going on, who were still full of ideas of how victory might yet be snatched from the jaws of defeat. If I am going to go on living, I have thought, I had better follow them. I tried to write a story about a reunion between my father and myself in heaven one time. An early draft of this book, in fact, began that way. I hoped in the story to become a really good friend of his, but the story turned out perversely, as stories about real people we have known often do. It seemed that in heaven people could be any age they liked, just so long as they had experienced that age on Earth. Thus, John D. Rockefeller, for example, the founder of Standard Oil, could be any age up to 98. King Tut could be any age up to 19, and so on. As author of the story, I was dismayed that my father in heaven chose to be only 9 years old. I myself had chosen to be 44, respectable, but still quite sexy too. My dismay with father turned to embarrassment and anger. He was lemur-like as a 9-year-old, all eyes and hands. He had an endless supply of pencils and pads and was forever tagging after me, drawing pictures of simply everything and insisting that I admire them when they were done. New acquaintances would sometimes ask me who that strange little boy was, and I would have to reply truthfully, since it was impossible to lie in heaven. It's my father. Bullies liked to torment him, since he was not like other children. He did not enjoy children's talk and children's games. Bullies would chase him and catch him and take off his pants and underpants and throw them down the mouth of hell. The mouth of hell looked like sort of a wishing well, but without a bucket and windlass. You could lean over its rim and hear ever so faintly the screams of Hitler and Nero and Salome and Judas and people like that far, far below. I could imagine Hitler, already experiencing maximum agony, periodically finding his head draped with my father's underpants. Whenever father had his pants stolen, he would come running to me, purple with rage. As like as not, I had just made some new friends and was impressing them with my urbanity. And there my father would be, bawling bloody murder, and with his little pecker waving in the breeze. I complained to my mother about him, but she said she knew nothing about him, or about me either, since she was only 16, so I was stuck with him, and all I could do was yell at him from time to time. For the love of God, Father, won't you please grow up? And so on. It insisted on being a very unfriendly story, so I quit writing it. And now, in July of 1945, Father came into Stegemeyer's restaurant, still very much alive. He was about the age that I am now, a widower with no interest in ever being married again, and with no evident wish for a lover of any kind. He had a mustache like the one I have today. I was clean-shaven then. A terrible ordeal was ending, a planetary economic collapse followed by a planetary war. Fighting men were starting to come home everywhere. You might think that Father would comment on that, however fleetingly, and on the new era that was being born. He did not. He told instead, and perfectly charmingly, about an adventure he had had that morning. While driving into the city, he had seen an old house being torn down. He had stopped and taken a closer look at its skeleton. He noticed that the sill under the front door was an unusual wood, which he finally decided was poplar. I gathered that it was about 8 inches square and 4 feet long. He admired it so much that the wreckers gave it to him. He borrowed a hammer from one of them and pulled out all the nails he could see. Then he took it to a sawmill to have it ripped into boards. He would decide later what to do with the boards. Mostly, he wanted to see the grain in this unusual wood. He had to promise the mill that there were no nails left in the timber. This he did, but there was still a nail in there. It had lost its head, so it was invisible. There was an ear-splitting shriek from the circular saw when it hit the nail. Smoke came from the belt that was trying to spin the stalled saw. Now Father had to pay for a new saw blade and a new belt too, and had been told never to come there with used lumber again. He was delighted somehow. The story was a sort of fairy tale with a moral in it for everyone. Uncle Alex and I had no very vivid response to the story. Like all of Father's stories, it was as neatly packaged and self-contained as an egg. So we ordered more beers. Uncle Alex would later become a co-founder of the Indianapolis chapter of Alcoholics Anonymous, although his wife would say often and pointedly that he himself had never been an alcoholic. He began to talk now about the Columbia Conserve Company, a cannery that Powers Hapgood's father, William, also a Harvard man, had founded in Indianapolis in 1903. It was a famous experiment in industrial democracy, but I had never heard of it before. There was a lot that I had never heard before. The Columbia Conserve Company made tomato soup and chili and ketchup and some other things. It was massively dependent on tomatoes. The company did not make a profit until 1916. As soon as it made one, though, Powers Hapgood's father began to give his employees some of the benefits he thought workers everywhere in the world were naturally entitled to. The other principal stockholders were his 2 brothers, also Harvard men, and they agreed with him. So he set up a council of 7 workers who were to recommend to the board of directors what the wages and working conditions should be. The board, without any prodding from anybody, had already declared that there would be no longer any seasonal layoffs, even in such a seasonal industry, and that there would be vacations with pay, and that medical care for workers and their dependents would be free, and that there would be sick pay and a retirement plan, and that the ultimate goal of the company was that, through a stock bonus plan, it would become the property of the workers. "It went bust," said Uncle Alex with a certain grim Darwinian satisfaction. My father said nothing. He may not have been listening. I now have at hand a copy of The Hapgoods, 3 Earnest Brothers, by Michael D. Marcaccio, the University Press of Virginia, Charlottesville, 1977. The 3 brothers in the subtitle were William, the founder of Columbia Conserve, and Norman and Hutchins, also Harvard men, who were both socialistically inclined journalists and editors and book writers in and around New York. According to Mr. Marcaccio, Columbia Conserve was a quite tidy success until 1931, when the Great Depression hit it murderously. Many workers were let go, and those who were kept on had their pay cut by 50%. A great deal of money was owed to Continental Can, which insisted that the company behave more conventionally towards its employees, even if they were stockholders, which most of them were. The experiment was over. There wasn't any money to pay for it anymore. Those who had received stock through profit sharing now owned bits of a company that was nearly dead. It did not go completely bust for a while. In fact, it still existed when Uncle Alex and Father and Powers Hapgood and I had lunch. But it was just another cannery, paying not 1 penny more than any other cannery paid. What was left of it was finally sold off to a stronger company in 1953. Now Powers Hapgood came into the restaurant, an ordinary-looking Middle Western Anglo-Saxon in a cheap business suit. He wore a Union badge in his lapel. He was cheerful. He knew my father slightly. He knew Uncle Alex quite well. He apologized for being late. He had been in court that morning testifying about violence on a picket line some months before. He personally had nothing to do with the violence. His days of daring do were behind him. Never again would he fight anybody or be clubbed to his knees or be locked up in jail. He was a talker, with far more wonderful stories than Father or Uncle Alex ever told. He was thrown into a lunatic asylum after he led the pickets at the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. He was in fights with organizers for John L. Lewis's United Mine Workers, which he considered too right-wing. In 1936, he was a CIO organizer at a strike against RCA in Camden, New Jersey. He was put in jail. When several thousand strikers surrounded the jail as a sort of reverse lynch mob, the sheriff thought it best to turn him loose again, and on and on. I have put my recollections of some of the stories he told into the mouth of, as I say, a fictitious character in this book. It turned out that he had been telling stories all morning in court, too. The judge was fascinated, and almost everybody else in court was, too, presumably by such unselfish high adventures. The judge had encouraged Hapgood, I gathered, to go on and on. Labor history was pornography of a sort in those days, and even more so in these days. In public schools and in the homes of nice people, it was, and remains, pretty much taboo to tell tales of labor's sufferings and daring do. I remember the name of the judge. It was Claycomb. I am able to remember it so easily because I had been a high school classmate of the judge's son, Moon. Moon Claycomb's father, according to Powers Hapgood, asked him this final question just before lunch. "Mr. Hapgood," he said, "why would a man from such a distinguished family and with such a fine education choose to live as you do?" "Why," said Hapgood, according to Hapgood, "because of the Sermon on the Mount, sir." And Moon Claycomb's father said this: "Court is adjourned until 2 p.m. What exactly was the Sermon on the Mount? It was the prediction by Jesus Christ that the poor in spirit would receive the kingdom of heaven, that all who mourned would be comforted, that the meek would inherit the earth, that those who hungered for righteousness would find it, that the merciful would be treated mercifully, that the pure in heart would see God, that the peacemakers would be called the sons of God, that those who were persecuted for righteousness' sake would also receive the kingdom of heaven, and on and on. The character in this book inspired by Powers Hapgood is unmarried and has problems with alcohol. Powers Hapgood was married and, so far as I know, had no serious problems with alcohol. There is another minor character whom I call Roy M. Cohn. He is modeled after the famous anti-communist lawyer and businessman named, straightforwardly enough, one would have to say, Roy M. Cohn. I include him with his kind permission, given yesterday, January 2nd, 1979, over the telephone. I promised to do him no harm and to present him as an appallingly effective attorney for either the prosecution or the defense of anyone. My dear father was silent for a good part of our ride home from that lunch with Powers Hapgood. We were in his Plymouth sedan. He was driving. Some 15 years later, he would be arrested for driving through a red light. It would be discovered that he had not had a driver's license for 20 years, which means that he was not licensed even on the day we had lunch with Powers Hapgood. His house was out in the country some. When we got to the edge of the city, he said that if we were lucky, we would see a funny dog. It was a German shepherd, he said, who could hardly stand up because he had been hit so often by automobiles. The dog still came tottering out to chase them, his eyes filled with bravery and rage. But the dog did not appear that day. He really did exist. I would see him another day when I was driving alone. He was crouched down on the shoulder of the road, ready to sink his teeth into my right front tire. But his charge was a pitiful thing to see. His rear end hardly worked at all anymore. He might as well have been dragging a steamer trunk with the power in his front feet alone. That was the day on which the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. But back to the day on which I lunched with Powers Hapgood. When Father put the car into his garage, he finally said something about the lunch. He was puzzled by the passionate manner in which Hapgood had discussed the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Surely one of the most spectacular and acrimoniously argued miscarriages of justice in American history. "You know," said Father, "I had no idea that there was any question about their guilt." That is how purely an artist my father was. There is mentioned in this book a violent confrontation between strikers and police and soldiers called the Cuyahoga Massacre. It is an invention, a mosaic composed of bits taken from tales of many such riots in not such olden times. It is a legend in the mind of the leading character in this book, Walter F. Starbuck, whose life was accidentally shaped by the massacre, even though it took place on Christmas morning in 1894, long before Starbuck was born. It goes like this. In October of 1894, Daniel McCone, the founder and owner of the Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron Company, then the largest single employer in Cleveland, Ohio, informed his factory workers through their foreman that they were to accept a 10% cut in pay. There was no union. McCone was a hard-bitten and brilliant little mechanical engineer, self-educated, born of working-class parents in Edinburgh, Scotland. Half his workforce, about 1,000 men under the leadership of an ordinary foundryman with a gift for oratory, Cone Jarvis, walked out, forcing the plant to shut down. They had found it almost impossible to feed and shelter and clothe their families, even without the cut in wages. All of them were white. Most of them were native-born. Nature sympathized that day. The sky and Lake Erie were identical in color, the same dead pewter gray. The little homes toward which the strikers trudged were near the factory. Many of them were owned, and their neighborhood grocery stores too, by Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron. Among the trudgers, as bitter and dejected as anyone, seemingly, were spies and agents provocateurs secretly employed and paid very well by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. That agency still exists and prospers, and is now a wholly owned subsidiary of the Ramjack Corporation. Daniel McCone had 2 sons, Alexander Hamilton McCone, then 22, and John, 25. Alexander had graduated without distinction from Harvard in the previous May. He was soft. He was shy. He was a stammerer. John, the elder son and the company's heir apparent, had flunked out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in his freshman year, and had been his father's most trusted aide ever since. Workers to a man, strikers and non-strikers alike, hated the father and his son John, but acknowledged that they knew more about shaping iron and steel than anyone else in the world. As for young Alexander, they found him girl-like and stupid and too cowardly ever to come near the furnaces and forges and drop hammers, where the most dangerous work was done. Workers would sometimes wave their handkerchiefs at him as a salute to his futility as a man. When Walter F. Starbuck, in whose mind this legend is, asked Alexander years later why he had ever gone to work in such an unhospitable place after Harvard, especially since Alexander's father had not insisted on it, he stammered out a reply, which when unscrambled was this: "I then believed that a rich man should have some understanding of the place from which his riches came. That was very juvenile of me. Great wealth should be accepted unquestioningly, or not at all." About Alexander's stammers before the Cuyahoga Massacre, they were little more than grace notes expressing excessive modesty. Never had one left him mute for more than 3 seconds, with all his thoughts held prisoner inside. And he would not have done much talking in the presence of his dynamic father and brother in any event, but his silence came to conceal a secret that was increasingly pleasant with each passing day. He was coming to understand the business as well as they did. Before they announced a decision, he almost always knew what it would be and should be and why. No one else knew it yet, but he, too, by God, was an industrialist and an engineer. When the strike came in October, he was able to guess many of the things that should be done, even though he had never been through a strike before. Harvard was 1,000,000 miles away. Nothing he had ever learned there would get the factory going again, but the Pinkerton Agency would, and the police would, and perhaps the National Guard. Before his father and brother said so, Alexander knew that there were plenty of men in other parts of the country who were desperate enough to take a job at almost any wage. When his father and brother did say this, he learned something else about business. There were companies, often pretending to be labor unions, whose sole business was to recruit such men. By the end of November, the chimneys of the factory were belching smoke again. The strikers had no money left for rent or food or fuel. Every large employer within 300 miles had been sent their names, so he would know what troublemakers they had been. Their nominal leader, Colin Jarvis, was in jail, awaiting trial on a trumped-up murder charge. On December 15th, the wife of Colin Jarvis, named Ma, led a delegation of 20 other strikers' wives to the main gate of the factory, asking to see Daniel McCone. He sent Alexander down to them with a scribbled note, which Alexander found himself able to read out loud to them without any speech impediment at all. It said that Daniel McCone was too busy to give time to strangers who had nothing to do with affairs from the Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron Company anymore. It suggested that they had mistaken the company for a charitable organization. It said that their churches or police precinct stations would be able to give them a list of organizations to which they might more appropriately plead for help, if they really needed help and felt that they deserved it. Ma Jarvis told Alexander that her own message was even simpler. The strikers would return to work on any terms. Most of them were now being evicted from their homes and had no place to go. "I am sorry," said Alexander. "I can only read my father's note again, if you would like me to." Alexander McCone would say many years later that the confrontation did not bother him a bit at the time. He was in fact elated, he said, to find himself such a reliable machine. A police captain now stepped forward. He warned the women that they were in violation of the law, assembling in such great numbers as to impede traffic and constitute a threat to public safety. He ordered them to disperse at once in the name of the law. This they did. They retreated across the vast plaza before the main gate. The facade of the factory had been designed to remind cultivated persons of the Piazza San Marco in Venice, Italy. The factory's clock tower was a half-scale replica of San Marco's famous campanile. It was from the belfry of that tower that Alexander and his father and his brother would watch the Cuyahoga massacre on Christmas morning. Each would have his own binoculars. Each would have his own little revolver, too. There were no bells in the belfry. Neither were there cafes and shops around the plaza below. The architect had justified the plaza on strictly utilitarian grounds. It provided any amount of room for wagons and buggies and horse-drawn streetcars as they came and went. The architect had also been matter-of-fact about the virtues of the factory as a fort. Any mob meaning to storm the front gate would first have to cross all that open ground. A single newspaper reporter from the Cleveland Plain Dealer, now a ramjack publication, retreated across the plaza with the women. He asked Ma Jarvis what she planned to do next. There was nothing much that she could do next, of course. The strikers weren't even strikers anymore, but simply unemployed persons being turned out of their homes. She gave a brave answer anyway. "We will be back," she said. What else could she say? He asked her when they would be back. Her answer was probably no more than the poetry of hopelessness in Christendom, with winter setting in. "On Christmas morning," she said. This was printed in the paper, whose editors felt that a threatening promise had been made, and the fame of this coming Christmas in Cleveland spread far and wide. Sympathizers with the strikers, preachers, writers, union organizers, populist politicians, and on, began to filter into the city as though expecting a miracle of some kind. They were frankly enemies of the economic order as it was constructed then. A company of National Guard infantrymen was mobilized by Edwin Kincaid, the governor of Ohio, to protect the factory. They were farm boys from the southern part of the state, selected because they had no friends or relatives among the strikers, no reason to see them as anything but unreasonable disturbers of the peace. They represented the American ideal, healthy, cheerful citizen soldiers who went about their ordinary business until their country suddenly needed an awesome display of weapons and discipline. They were supposed to appear as though from nowhere, to the consternation of America's enemies. When the trouble was over, they would vanish again. The regular army of the country, which had fought the Indians until the Indians could fight no more, was down to about 30,000 men. As for the utopian militias throughout the country, they almost all consisted of farm boys, since the health of the factory workers was so bad and their hours so long. It was about to be discovered, incidentally, in the Spanish-American War, that militiamen were worse than useless on battlefields. They were so poorly trained. And that was surely the impression young Alexander Hamilton McCone had of the militiamen who arrived at the factory on Christmas Eve, that these were not soldiers. They were brought on a special train to a siding inside the factory's high iron fence. They straggled out of the car and onto the loading platform as though they were ordinary passengers on various errands. Their uniforms were only partly buttoned, and often misbuttoned at that. Several had lost their hats. Almost all carried laughably unmilitary suitcases and parcels. Their officers? Their captain was the postmaster of Greenfield, Ohio. Their 2 lieutenants were twin sons of the president of the Greenfield Bank and Trust Company. The postmaster and the banker had both done local favors for the governor. The commissions were their rewards. And the officers, in turn, had rewarded those who had pleased them in some way by making them sergeants or corporals. And the privates, in turn, voters or sons of voters, had it within their power, if they felt like using it, to ruin the lives of their superiors with contempt and ridicule, which could go on for generations. There, on the loading platform at the Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron Company, old Daniel McCone finally had to ask one of the many soldiers milling about and eating at the same time, "Who is in charge here?" As luck would have it, he had put the question to the captain, who told him this: "Well, as much as anybody, I guess I am." To their credit, and although armed with bayonets and live ammunition, the militiamen would not harm a single soul on the following day. They were quartered in an idled machine shop. They slept in the aisles. Each one had brought his own food from home. They had hams and roasted chickens and cakes and pies. They ate whatever they pleased and whenever they pleased, and turned the machine shop into a picnic ground. They left the place looking like a village dump. They did not know any better. Yes, and old Daniel McCone and his 2 sons spent the night in the factory, too, on camp cots in their offices at the foot of the bell tower, and with loaded revolvers under their pillows. When would they have their Christmas dinner? At 3 o'clock on the following afternoon. The trouble would surely be over by then. Young Alexander was to make use of his fine education, his father had told him, by composing and delivering an appropriate prayer of thanksgiving before they ate that meal. Regular company guards, augmented by Pinkerton agents and city policemen, meanwhile, took turns patrolling the company fence all night. The company guards, ordinarily armed only with pistols, had rifles and shotguns too, borrowed from friends or brought from home. 4 Pinkerton men were allowed to sleep all through the night. They were master craftsmen of a sort. They were sharpshooters. It was not bugles that awakened the McCones the next morning. It was the sound of hammering and sawing, which gabbled around the plaza. Carpenters were building a high scaffold by the main gate just inside the fence. The chief of police of Cleveland was to stand atop it, in plain view of everyone. At an opportune moment, he was to read the Ohio Riot Act to the crowd. This public reading was required by law. The act said that any unlawful assembly of 12 persons or more had to disperse within an hour of having the act read to it. If it did not disperse, its members would be guilty of a felony punishable by imprisonment for up to 10 years to life. Nature sympathized again, for a gentle snow began to fall. Yes, and an enclosed carriage drawn by 2 white horses clattered into the plaza at full speed and stopped by the gate. Into the dawn's early light stepped Colonel George Redfield, the governor's son-in-law, who had been commissioned by the governor and who had come all the way from Sandusky to take command of the militiamen. He owned a lumber mill and was in the feed and ice businesses besides. He had no military experience, but was costumed as a cavalryman. He wore a saber, which was a gift from his father-in-law. He went at once to the machine shop to address his troops. Soon after that, wagons carrying riot police arrived. They were ordinary Cleveland policemen, but armed with wooden shields and blunt lances. An American flag was flown from the top of the bell tower, and another from the pole by the main gate. It was to be a pageant, young Alexander supposed. There would be no actual killing or wounding. All would be said by the way men posed. The strikers themselves had sent word that they would have their wives and children with them, and that not one of them would have a gun, or even a knife with a blade more than 3 inches long. "We wish only," said their letter, "to take one last look at the factory to which we gave the best years of our lives, and to show our faces to all who may care to look upon them, to show them to God Almighty alone, if only He will look, and to ask, as we stand mute and motionless, does any American deserve misery and heartbreak such as we now know?" Alexander was not insensitive to the beauty of the letter. It had, in fact, been written by the poet Henry Niles Whistler, then in the city to hearten the strikers, a fellow Harvard man. It deserved a majestic reply, thought Alexander. He believed that the flags and the ranks of citizen soldiers and the solemn, steady presence of the police would surely do the job. The law would be read out loud, and all would hear it, and all would go home. Peace should not be broken for any cause. Alexander meant to say in his prayer that afternoon that God should protect the working people from leaders like Colin Jarvis, who had encouraged them to bring such misery and heartbreak on themselves. Amen, he said to himself. And the people came as promised. They came on foot. In order to discourage them, the city fathers had canceled all streetcar service in that part of the city that day. There were many children among them, and even infants in arms. One infant would be shot to death and inspired the poem by Henry Niles Whistler, later put to music and still sung today, Bonnie Failey. Where were the soldiers? They had been standing in front of the factory fence since 8 o'clock, with bayonets already fixed, with full packs on their backs. Those packs weighed 50 pounds and more. They were Colonel Redfield's idea of how to make his men more fearsome. They were in a single rank, which stretched the width of the plaza. The battle plan was this. If the crowd would not disperse when told to, the soldiers were to level their bayonets and to clear the plaza slowly but irresistibly, glacially, maintaining a perfect straight rank that bristled with cold steel and advancing, always on command, 1 step, then 2, then 3, then 4. Only the soldiers had been outside the fence since 8. The snow had kept on falling, so when the first members of the crowd appeared at the far end of the plaza, they gazed at the factory over an expanse of virgin snow. The only footprints were those they themselves had just made. And many more people came than had spiritual business to conduct specifically with Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron. The strikers themselves were mystified as to who all these other ragged strangers might be, who also often had brought their families along. These outsiders, too, wished to demonstrate to simply anybody their misery and heartbreak at Christmastide. Young Alexander, peering through his binoculars, read a sign a man was carrying that said, "Erie Coal and Iron, unfair to workers." Erie Coal and Iron wasn't even an Ohio firm. It was in Buffalo, New York. So it was against considerable odds that Bonnie Failey, the infant killed at the massacre, was actually the child of a striker against Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron, that Henry Niles Whistler was able to say in the refrain of his poem about her, damn you, Dan McCone, with a soul of pig iron and a heart of stone." Young Alexander read the sign about Erie Coal and Iron while standing at a second-story window in an office wing abutting the north wall of the bell tower. He was in a long gallery, also of Venetian inspiration, which had a window every 10 feet and a mirror at its far end. The mirror made its length appear to be infinite. The windows looked out over the plaza. It was in this gallery that the 4 sharpshooters supplied by Pinkerton set up their places of business. Each installed a table at his chosen window and set a comfortable chair behind that. There was a rifle rest on each table. The sharpshooter nearest Alexander had put a sandbag on his table and had hammered a groove into it with the edge of his hairy hand. There his rifle would rest, with its butt tucked into his shoulder, as he squinted down his sights at this face or that face in the crowd from his easy chair. The sharpshooter further down the corridor was a machinist by trade, and had built a squat tripod with a swiveling oarlock on top. This squatted on his table. It was into this oarlock that he would slip his rifle if trouble came. Patent applied for, he had told Alexander of his tripod, and he patted the thing. Each man had his ammunition and his cleaning rod and his cleaning patches and his oil laid out on the table, as though they might be for sale. All the windows were still closed now. At some of the others were far angrier and less orderly men. These were regular company guards, who had been up most of the night. Several had been drinking, so they said, to stay awake. They had been stationed at their windows with their rifles or shotguns in case the mob should attack the factory at all costs, and nothing but withering fire would turn them away. They had persuaded themselves by now that this attack would surely come. Their alarm and bravado were the first strong hints young Alexander received as he would tell young Walter F. Starbuck, decades afterward, again stammering, that there were certain instabilities inherent in the pageant. He himself, of course, was carrying a loaded revolver in his overcoat pocket, and so were his father and brother, who now came into the corridor to approve of the arrangements one last time. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, and was time to open the windows, they said. The plaza was full. It was time to go to the top of the tower, they told Alexander, for the best view of all. So the windows were opened, and the sharpshooters laid their rifles in their cradles of different kinds. Who were the 4 sharpshooters really, and was there really such a trade? There was less work for sharpshooters than there was for hangmen at the time. Not one of the 4 had ever been hired in this capacity before, nor was he likely, unless war came, to be paid for such work ever again. One was a part-time Pinkerton agent, and the other 3 were his friends. The 4 of them hunted together regularly, and had for years praised one another for what unbelievably good shots they were. So when the Pinkerton agency let it be known that they could use 4 sharpshooters, they materialized almost instantly, like the company of citizen soldiers. The man with the tripod had invented the device for the occasion, nor had the man with the sandbag ever couched his rifle on a sandbag before. So it was, too, that the chairs and tables and the tidy displays of ammunition and all that, they had agreed among themselves as to how truly professional sharpshooters should comport themselves. Years later, Alexander McCone, when asked by Starbuck what he thought the principal cause of the Cuyahoga massacre had been, would reply, "American amateurism in the matters of life and death." When the windows were opened, the oceanic murmurs of the crowd came in with the cold air. The crowd wished to be silent, and imagined itself to be silent, but this person had to whisper a little something, and that one had to reply, and so on. Hence, it sounds like a sea. It was mainly this seeming surf that Alexander heard as he stood with his father and brother in the belfry. The defenders of the factory were quiet. Except for the rattles and bumps of the opening of the windows on the second floor, they had made no reply. Alexander's father said this as they waited. "It is no dainty thing to shape iron and steel to human needs, my boys. No man in his right mind would do such work, if it were not for fear of cold and hunger. The question is, my boys, how much does the world need iron and steel products? In case anybody wants some, Dan McCone knows how they're made." Now there was a tiny quickening of life inside the fence. The chief of police of Cleveland, carrying a piece of paper on which the riot act was written, climbed the steps to the top of the scaffold. This was to be the climax of the pageant, young Alexander supposed, a moment of terrible beauty. But then he sneezed up there in the belfry. Not only were his lungs emptied of air, but his romantic vision was destroyed. What was about to happen below, he realized, was not majestic. It would be insane. There was no such thing as magic, and yet his father and his brother and the governor, and probably even President Grover Cleveland, expected this police chief to become a wizard, a Merlin, to make the crowd vanish with a magic spell. It will not work, he thought. It cannot work. It did not work. The chief cast his spell. His shouted words bounced off the buildings, warred with their own echoes, and sounded like Babylonian by the time they reached Alexander's ears. Absolutely nothing happened. The chief climbed down from the scaffold. His manner indicated that he had not expected much of anything to happen, that there were simply too many people out there. It was with great modesty that he rejoined his own shock troops, who were armed with shields and lances but safe inside the fence. He was not about to ask them to arrest anyone or to do anything provocative against a crowd so large. But Colonel Redfield was enraged. He had the gate opened a crack to let him out so he could join his half-frozen troops. He took his place between 2 farm boys at the center of the long line. He ordered his men to level their bayonets at those in front of him. Next, he ordered them to take 1 step forward. This they did. Looking down at the plaza, young Alexander could see the people at the space between the factory fence and the undefended rears of the soldiers. Colonel Redfield, his eyes blazing straight ahead, had no idea what was happening on either side. He ordered yet another advance. Now the crowd behind the soldiers began to behave quite badly. A youth jumped onto a soldier's pack like a monkey. The soldier sat down hard and struggled almost comically, trying to rise again. Soldier after soldier was brought down in this way. If one got back to his feet, he was pulled down again, and the soldiers began to crawl towards each other for mutual protection. They refused to shoot. They formed a defensive heap instead, a paralyzed porcupine. Colonel Redfield was not among them. He was nowhere to be seen. No one was ever found who would admit to ordering the sharpshooters and the guards to open fire from the windows of the factory, but the firing began. 14 people were killed outright by bullets, one of them a soldier. 23 were seriously wounded. Alexander would say, when an old man, that the shooting sounded no more serious than popcorn, and that he thought a freakish wind had blown across the plaza below, since the people seemed to be blowing away like leaves. When it was all over, there was general satisfaction that honor had been served and that justice had been done. Law and order had been restored. Old Daniel McCone would say to his sons as he looked out over the battlefield, vacant now except for bodies, "Like it or not, boys, that's the sort of business you're in." Colonel Redfield would be found in a side street, naked and out of his head, but otherwise unharmed. Young Alexander did not try to speak afterward until he had to speak, which was at Christmas dinner that afternoon. He was asked to say grace. He discovered that he had become a bubbling booby, that his stammer was so bad now that he could not speak at all. He would never go to the factory again. He would become Cleveland's leading art collector and the chief donor to the Cleveland Museum of Fine Arts, demonstrating that the McCone family was interested in more than money and power, for money's and power's sakes. His stammer was so bad for the rest of his life that he seldom ventured outside his mansion on Euclid Avenue. He had married a Rockefeller 1 month before his stammer became so bad. Otherwise, as he would later say, he would probably never have married at all. He had one daughter, who was embarrassed by him, as was his wife. He would make only one friendship after the massacre. It would be with a child. It would be with the son of his cook and his chauffeur. The multimillionaire wanted someone who would play chess with him many hours a day. So he seduced the boy, so to speak, with simpler games first, hearts and old maid, checkers and dominoes, but he also taught him chess. Soon they were playing only chess. Their conversations were limited to conventional chess taunts and teasings, which had not changed in 1,000 years. Samples. "Have you played this game before?" "Really?" "Spot me a queen." "Is this a trap?" The boy was Walter F. Starbuck. He was willing to spend his childhood and youth so unnaturally for this reason. Alexander Hamilton McCone promised to send him to Harvard someday. K.V. Help the weak ones that cry for me. Help the prosecuted and the victim, because they are your better friends. They are the comrades that fight and fall as your father and Bartolo fought and fell yesterday for the conquest of the joy of freedom for all poor workers. In this struggle of life, you will find more love and you will be loved. Nicola Sacco, 1891-1927. In his last letter to his 13-year-old son, Dante, August 18, 1927, 3 days before his execution in Charlestown Prison, Boston, Massachusetts. Bartolo was Bartolo Vanzetti, 1888-1927, who died the same night in the same electric chair, the invention of a dentist. So did an even more forgotten man, Celestino Medeiros, 1894-1927, who confessed to the crime of which Sacco and Vanzetti have been convicted, even while his own conviction for another murder was being appealed. Medeiros was a notorious criminal who behaved unselfishly at the end. 1. Life goes on, yes, and a fool and his self-respect are soon parted, perhaps never to be reunited even on Judgment Day. Pay attention, please, for years as well as people are characters in this book, which is the story of my life so far. 1929 wrecked the American economy. 1931 sent me to Harvard. 1938 got me my first job in the federal government. 1946 gave me a wife. 1946 gave me an ungrateful son. 1953 fired me from the federal government. Thus do I capitalize years as though they were proper names. 1970 gave me a job in the Nixon White House. 1975 sent me to prison for my own preposterous contributions to the American political scandals known collectively as Watergate. 3 years ago, as I write, 1977 was about to turn me loose again. I felt like a piece of garbage. I was wearing olive drab coveralls, the prison uniform. I sat alone in a dormitory, on a cot that I had stripped of its bedding. A blanket, 2 sheets and a pillowcase, which were to be returned to my government along with my uniform, were folded neatly on my lap. My speckled old hands were clasped atop these. I stared straight ahead at a wall on the second floor of a barracks at the Federal Minimum Security Adult Correctional Facility on the edge of Finletter Air Force Base, 35 miles from Atlanta, Georgia. I was waiting for a guard to conduct me to the administration building, where I would be given my release papers and my civilian clothes. There would be no one to greet me at the gate. Nowhere in the world was there anyone who had a forgiving hug for me, or a free meal, or a bed for a night or two. If anyone had been watching me, he would have seen me do something quite mysterious every 5 minutes or so. Without changing my blank expression, I would lift my hands from the bedding, and I would clap 3 times. I will explain why by and by. It was 9 in the morning on April 21st. The guard was 1 hour late. A fighter plane leaped up from the top of a nearby runway, destroyed enough energy to heat 100 homes for 1,000 years, tore the sky to shreds. I did not bat an eyelash. The event was merely tedious to old prisoners and guards at Finletter. It happened all the time. Most of the other prisoners, all of them convicted of nonviolent white-collar crimes, had been trundled away in purple school buses to work details around the base. Only a small housekeeping crew had been left behind, to wash windows, to mop floors. There were a few others around, writing or reading or napping, too sick with heart trouble or back trouble usually to do manual work of any kind. I myself would have been feeding a mangle in the laundry at the base hospital if it had been a day like any other day. My health was excellent, as they say. Was I shown no special respect in prison as a Harvard man? It was no distinction, actually. I had met or heard of at least 7 others, and no sooner would I leave than my cot would be taken by Virgil Greathouse, former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, who was also a Harvard man. I was quite low on the educational ladder at Finletter, with nothing but a poor bachelor's degree. I was not even a Phi Beta Kappa. We must have had 20 or more Phi Beta Kappas, a dozen or more medical doctors, an equal number of dentists, a veterinarian, a doctor of divinity, a doctor of economics, a doctor of philosophy and chemistry, and simply shoals of disbarred lawyers. Lawyers were so common that we had a joke for newcomers that went like this. If you find yourself talking to somebody who hasn't been to law school, watch your step. He's either the warden or a guard. My own poor degree was in the liberal arts, with some emphasis on history and economics. It was my plan when I entered Harvard to become a public servant, an employee rather than an elected official. I believed that there could be no higher calling in a democracy than to a lifetime in government. Since I did not know what branch of government might take me on, whether the State Department or the Bureau of Indian Affairs or whatever, I would make my wisdom as widely applicable as possible. For this reason did I take a liberal arts degree. And I speak now of my plans and my beliefs, but being so new to the planet in those days, I had been glad to adopt as my own the plans and beliefs of a much older man. He was a Cleveland multimillionaire named Alexander Hamilton McCone, a member of the Harvard class of 1894. He was the reclusive, stammering son of Daniel McCone. Daniel McCone was a brilliant and brutal Scottish engineer and metallurgist who founded the Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron Company, the largest single employer in Cleveland when I was born. Imagine being born as long ago as 1913. Will young people of today doubt me if I aver with a straight face that the Ohio skies back then were often darkened by flocks of hooting pterodactyls, and that 40-ton brontosaurus basked and crooned in the Cuyahoga River's ooze? No. Alexander Hamilton McCone was 41 years old when I was born into his mansion on Euclid Avenue. He was married to the former Alice Rockefeller, who was even richer than he was, and who spent most of her time in Europe with their one child, a daughter named Clara. Mother and daughter, no doubt embarrassed by Mr. McCone's terrible speech impediment, and even more dismayed perhaps by his wanting to do nothing with his life but read books all day long, were seldom home. Divorce was unthinkable back then. "Clara, are you still alive?" She hated me. Some people did, and do. That's life. And what was I to Mr. McCone, that I should have been born into the unhappy stillness of his mansion? My mother, born Anna Karas in Russian Lithuania, was his cook. My father, born Stanislaus Stankiewicz in Russian Poland, was his bodyguard and chauffeur. They genuinely loved him. Mr. McCone built a handsome apartment for them, and for me too, on the second floor of his carriage house. And, as I grew older, I became his playmate, always indoors. He taught me hearts and old maid, checkers and dominoes, and chess. Soon we were playing only chess. He did not play well. I won almost all of the games, and it is possible that he was secretly drunk. He never tried hard to win, I thought. In any event, and very early on, he began to tell me and my parents that I was a genius, which I surely was not, and that he would send me to Harvard. He must have said to my father and mother 1,000 times over the years, "You are going to find yourselves the proud parents of a perfect Harvard gentleman someday." To that end, when I was about 10 years old, he had us change our family name from Stankiewicz to Starbuck. I would be better received at Harvard, he said, if I had an Anglo-Saxon name. Thus did Walter F. Starbuck become my name. He himself had done badly at Harvard, had scarcely squeaked through. He had also been scorned socially, not only for his stammer, but for his being the obscenely rich son of an immigrant. There was every reason for him to hate Harvard, but I watched him over the years so sentimentalize and romanticize and finally so worship the place that by the time I was in high school, he believed that Harvard professors were the wisest men in the history of the world. America could be paradise if only all high posts in government were filled by Harvard men. And as things turned out, when I went to work for the government as a bright young man in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Department of Agriculture, more and more posts were being filled by Harvard men. That seemed only right to me back then. It seems mildly comical to me now. Not even in prison, as I say, is there anything special about Harvard men. While I was a student, I sometimes caught the whiff of a promise that, after I graduated, I would be better than average at explaining important matters to people who were slow at catching on. Things did not work out that way. So I sat there in prison in 1977, waiting for the guard to come. I wasn't annoyed at his being an hour late so far. I was in no hurry to go any place, had no place in particular to go. The guard's name was Clyde Carter. He was one of the few friends I had in prison. Our chief bond was that we had taken the same correspondence course in bartending from a diploma mill in Chicago, the Illinois Institute of Instruction, a division of the Ramjack Corporation. On the same day, and in the same mail, each of us had received his Doctor of Mixology degree. Clyde had then surpassed me by taking the school's course in air conditioning as well. Clyde was a third cousin to the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. He was about 5 years younger than the President, but was otherwise his perfect spit and image. He had the same nice manners, the same bright smile. A degree in bartending was enough for me. That was all I intended to do with the rest of my life. Tend a quiet bar somewhere, ideally in a club for gentlemen. And I lifted my old hands from the folded bedding and I clapped 3 times. Another fighter plane leaped up from the tip of a nearby runway, tore the sky to shreds. I thought this: at least I don't smoke anymore. It was true. I, who used to smoke 4 packages of unfiltered Pall Malls a day, was no longer a slave to King nicotine. I would soon be reminded of how much I used to smoke, for the gray pinstripe 3-piece Brooks Brothers suit awaiting me over in the supply room would be riddled with cigarette burns. There was a hole the size of a dime in the crotch, I remembered. A newspaper photograph was taken of me as I sat in the back of the federal marshal's green sedan right after I was sentenced to prison. It was widely interpreted as showing how ashamed I was, haggard, horrified, unable to look anyone in the eye. It was, in fact, a photograph of a man who had just set his pants on fire. I thought now about Sacco and Vanzetti. When I was young, I believed that the story of their martyrdom would cause an irresistible mania for justice to the common people to spread throughout the world. Does anybody know or care who they were anymore? No. I thought about the Cuyahoga Massacre, which was the bloodiest single encounter between strikers and an employer in the history of American labor. It happened in Cleveland, in front of the main gate of Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron, on Christmas morning in 1894. That was long before I was born. My parents were still children in the Russian Empire when it happened, but the man who sent me to Harvard, Alexander Hamilton McCone, watched it from the factory clock tower in the company of his father and his older brother John. That was when he ceased to be a slight stammerer and became, when the least bit anxious about anything, a bubbling booby of totally blocked language instead. Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron, incidentally, lost its identity save in labor history long ago. It was absorbed by Youngstown Steel shortly after the Second World War, and Youngstown Steel itself has now become a mere division of the Ramjack Corporation. Peace. Yes, and I lifted my old hands from the folded bedding and I clapped 3 times. Here was what that was all about, as silly as it was. Those 3 claps completed a rowdy song I had never liked, and which I had not thought about for 30 years or more. I was making my mind as blank as possible, you see, since the past was so embarrassing and the future so terrifying. I had made so many enemies over the years that I doubted that I could even get a job as a bartender somewhere. I would simply get dirtier and raggedier, I thought, since I would have no money coming in from anywhere. I would wind up on Skid Row and learn to keep the cold out by drinking wine, I thought, although I had never liked alcohol. The worst thing, I thought, was that I would be asleep in an alley in the Bowery, say, and juvenile delinquents who loathed dirty old men would come along with a can of gasoline. They would soak me in it, and they would touch me off. And the worst thing about that, I thought, would be having my eyeballs lapped by flames. No wonder I craved an empty mind. But I could achieve mental vacancy only intermittently. Most of the time, as I sat there on the cot, I settled for an only slightly less perfect peace, which was filled with thoughts that need not scare me, about Sacco and Vanzetti, as I say, and about the Cuyahoga Massacre, about playing chess with old Alexander Hamilton McCone, and on and on. Perfect blankness, when I achieved it, lasted only 10 seconds or so, and then it would be wrecked by the song, sung loudly and clearly in my head by an alien voice, which required for its completion that I clap 3 times. The words were highly offensive to me when I first heard them, which was at a drunken stag party at Harvard during my freshman year. It was a song to be kept secret from women. It may be that no woman has ever heard it, even at this late date. The intent of the lyricist obviously was to so coarsen the feelings of males who sang the song that the singers could never believe again what most of us believed with all our hearts back then, that women were more spiritual, more sacred than men. I still believe that about women. Is that too comical? I have loved only 4 women in my life: my mother, my late wife, a woman to whom I was once affianced, and 1 other. I will describe them all by and by. Let it be said now, though, that all 4 seemed more virtuous, braver about life, and closer to the secrets of the universe than I could ever be. Be that as it may, I will now set down the words to the frightful song. And even though I have been technically responsible, because of my high position in a corporate structure in recent years, for the publication of some of the most scurrilous books about women ever written, I still find myself shrinking from setting on paper, where they have perhaps never been before, the words to the song. The tune to which they were sung, incidentally, was an old one, a tune that I call Reuben Reuben. It no doubt has many other names. Readers of the words should realize, too, that I heard them sung not by middle-aged roughnecks, but by college boys, by children really, who, with a Great Depression going on and with a Second World War coming, and with most of them mocked by their own virginity, had reason to be petrified of all the things that women of that time would expect of them. Women would expect them to earn good money after they graduated, and they did not see how they could do that with all the businesses shutting down. Women would expect them to be brave soldiers, and there seemed every chance that they would go to pieces when the shrapnel and bullets flew. Who could be absolutely responsible for his own reactions when the shrapnel and bullets flew? There would be flamethrowers and poison gas. There would be terrific bangs. The man standing beside you could have his head blown off, and his throat would be a fountain. And women, when they became their wives, would expect them to be perfect lovers, even on the wedding night. Subtle, tender, raffish, respectful, titillatingly debauched, and knowing as much about the reproductive organs of both sexes as Harvard Medical School. I recall a discussion of a daring magazine article that appeared at that time. It told of the frequency of sexual intercourse by American males in various professions and trades. Firemen were the most ardent, making love 10 times a week. College professors were the least ardent, making love once a month. And a classmate of mine who, as it happened, would actually be killed in the Second World War, shook his head mournfully and said, "Gee, I'd give anything to be a college professor." The shocking song, then, may really have been a way of honoring the powers of women, of dealing with the fears they inspired. It might properly be compared with a song making fun of lions, sung by lion hunters on a night before a hunt. The words were these: Sally in the garden, sifting cinders, lifted up her leg and farted like a man. The bursting of her bloomers broke 16 winders. The cheeks of her ass went. Here, the singers, in order to complete the stanza, were required to clap 3 times. 2. My official title in the Nixon White House, the job I was holding when I was arrested for embezzlement, perjury, and obstruction of justice, was this: the President's Special Advisor on Youth Affairs. I was paid $36,000 a year. I had an office, but no secretary, in the sub-basement of the Executive Office Building, directly underneath, as it happened, the office where burglaries and other crimes on behalf of President Nixon were planned. I could hear people walking overhead and raised voices sometimes. On my own level in the sub-basement, my only companions were heating and air conditioning equipment, and a Coca-Cola machine that only I knew about, I think. I was the only person to patronize that machine. Yes, and I read college and high school newspapers and magazines and Rolling Stone and Crawdaddy and anything else that claimed to speak for youth. I cataloged political statements in the words of popular songs. My chief qualification for the job, I thought, was that I myself had been a radical at Harvard, starting in my junior year, nor had I been co-chairman of the Harvard chapter of the Young Communist League. I had been co-chairman of the radical weekly paper, the Bay State Progressive. I was, in fact, openly and proudly a card-carrying communist until Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact in 1939. Hell and heaven, as I saw it, were making common cause against weakly defended peoples everywhere. After that, I became a cautious believer in capitalistic democracy again. It was once so acceptable in this country to be a communist that my being one did not prevent my winning a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford after Harvard, and then landing a job in Roosevelt's Department of Agriculture after that. What could be so repulsive, after all, during the Great Depression, especially with yet another war for natural wealth and markets coming, in a young man's belief that each person could work as well as he or she was able and should be rewarded, sick or well, young or old, brave or frightened, talented or imbecilic, according to his or her simple needs? How could anyone treat me as a person with a diseased mind if I thought that war need never come again, if only common people everywhere would take control of the planet's wealth, disband their national armies, and forget their national boundaries, if only they would think of themselves ever after as brothers and sisters, yes, and as mothers and fathers too, and children of all other common people everywhere. The only person who would be excluded from such a friendly and merciful society would be one who took more wealth than he or she needed at any time. And even now, at the rueful age of 66, I find my knees still turn to water when I encounter anyone who still considers it a possibility that there will one day be one big, happy, peaceful family on earth, the family of man. If I were this very day to meet myself as I was in 1933, I would swoon with pity and respectfulness. So my idealism did not die even in the Nixon White House, did not die even in prison, did not die even when I became, my most recent employment, a vice president of the Down Home Records division of the Ramjack Corporation. I still believe that peace and plenty of happiness can be worked out some way. I am a fool. When I was Richard M. Nixon's special advisor on youth affairs, from 1970 until my arrest in 1975, smoking 4 packs of unfiltered Pall Malls a day, nobody ever asked me for facts or opinion or anything. I need not even have come to work, and I might have spent my time better in helping my poor wife with the little interior decorating business she ran out of our tight little brick bungalow out in Chevy Chase, Maryland. The only visitors I ever had to my subterranean office, its walls golden brown with cigarette tars, were the president's special burglars, whose office was above mine. They suddenly realized one day when I had a coughing fit that somebody was right below them, and that I might be able to hear their conversations. They performed experiments, with one of them yelling and stamping upstairs, and another one listening in my office. They satisfied themselves that I had heard nothing, and was a harmless old poop in any event. The yeller and stamper was a former Central Intelligence Agency operative, a writer of spy thrillers, and a graduate of Brown University. The listener below was a former agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a former district attorney, and a graduate of Fordham University. I myself, as I may have said already, was a Harvard man. And this Harvard man, knowing full well that everything he wrote would be shredded and baled with all the rest of the White House waste paper, unread, still turned out some 200 or more weekly reports on the sayings and doings of youth, with footnotes, bibliographies, and appendices and all. But the conclusions implied by my materials changed so little over the years that I might as well have simply sent the same telegrams each week to Limbo. It would have said this: young people still refuse to see the obvious impossibility of world disarmament and economic equality. Could be fault of New Testament. Quod vide. Walter F. Starbuck, President's Special Advisor on Youth Affairs. At the end of every futile day in the sub-basement, I would go home to the only wife I have ever had, who was Ruth, waiting for me in our little brick bungalow in Chevy Chase, Maryland. She was Jewish, which I am not, so our only child, a son who is now a book reviewer for the New York Times, is half Jewish. He has further confused racial and religious matters by marrying a black nightclub singer, who has 2 children by a former husband. The former husband was a nightclub comedian of Puerto Rican extraction named Jerry Cha-Cha Rivera, who was shot as an innocent bystander during the robbery of a ramjack car wash in Hollywood. My son has adopted the children, so that they are now legally my grandchildren. My only grandchildren. Life goes on. My late wife Ruth, the grandmother of these children, was born in Vienna. Her family owned a rare bookstore there, before the Nazis took it away from them. She was 6 years younger than I. Her father and mother and 2 siblings were killed in concentration camps. She herself was hidden by a Christian family, but was discovered and arrested, along with the head of that family, in 1942. So she herself was in a concentration camp near Munich, finally liberated by American troops for the last 2 years of the war. She herself would die in her sleep in 1974 of congestive heart failure, 2 weeks before my own arrest. Whither I went, and no matter how clumsily, there did my Ruth go, as long as she could. If I marveled at this out loud, she would say, "Where else could I be? What else could I do?" She might have been a great translator for one thing. Languages came so easily to her as they did not to me. I spent 4 years in Germany after the Second World War, but never mastered German. But there was no European language that Ruth could not speak at least a little bit. She passed the time in the concentration camp waiting for death by getting other prisoners to teach her languages she did not know. Thus did she become fluent in Romany, the tongue of the gypsies, and even learned the words to some songs in Basque. She might have become a portrait artist. That was another thing she had done in prison. With a finger dipped in lampblack, she had drawn on the walls likenesses of those passing through. She might have been a famous photographer. When she was only 16, 3 years before Germany annexed Austria, she photographed 100 beggars in Vienna, all of whom were terribly wounded veterans of World War I. These were sold in portfolios, one of which I have found recently, and to my heartbroken amazement, in the collection of New York's Museum of Modern Art. She could also play the piano, whereas I am tone-deaf. I cannot even sing Sally in the Garden on key. I was Ruth's inferior, you might say. When things started to go really badly for me in the 50s and 60s, when I was unable to get a decent job anywhere, despite all the high posts I had held in government, despite all the important people I knew, It was Ruth who rescued an unpopular little family out in Chevy Chase. She began with 2 failures, which depressed her at first, but which would later make her laugh so hard that tears streamed from her eyes. Her first failure was as a piano player in a cocktail lounge. The proprietor, when he fired her, told her that she was too good, that his particular clientele didn't appreciate the finer things in life. Her second failure was as a wedding photographer. There was always an air of pre-war doom about her photographs, which no retoucher could eradicate. It was as though the entire wedding party would wind up in the trenches or the gas chambers by and by. But then she became an interior decorator, beguiling prospective clients with watercolors of rooms she would like to do for them, and I was her clumsy assistant, hanging draperies, holding wallpaper samples against a wall, taking phone messages from clients, running errands, picking up swatches of this and that, and on and on. I set fire to $1,100 worth of blue velvet draperies one time. No wonder my son never respected me. When did he ever have a chance to? My God, there his mother was, trying to support the family, and scrimping and saving to get by. And there his unemployed father was, always in the way and helpless, and finally setting fire to a fortune in draperies with a cigarette. Hooray for a Harvard education! Oh, to be the proud son of a Harvard man! Ruth was a tiny woman, incidentally, with coppery skin and straight black hair and high cheekbones and deep-set eyes. The first time I laid eyes on her, which was in Nuremberg, Germany in late August of 1945, she was wearing voluminous army fatigues, and I mistook her for a gypsy boy. I was a civilian employee of the Defense Department, 32 years old. I had never married. I had been a civilian all through the war, often exercising more real power than generals or admirals. Now I was in Nuremberg, ogling the wreckage of war for the first time. I had been sent over to oversee the feeding and housing of the American, British, French, and Russian delegations to the war crimes trials. I had previously set up recuperation centers for American soldiers in various resort areas in the United States, so I knew a little something about the hotel trade. I was to be a dictator to the Germans as far as food and drink and beds were concerned. My official vehicle was a white Mercedes touring car, a 4-door convertible with a windshield for the back seat as well as the front. It had a siren. It had little sockets on its front fenders for flags. I, of course, flew American flags. This dreamboat, as young people might call it, had been an anniversary present from Heinrich Himmler, the creator of concentration camps, to his wife in the good old days. Wherever I went, I had an armed chauffeur. My father, remember, had been a millionaire's armed chauffeur. And I was being driven down the main street, the Königstrasse, one August afternoon. The War Crimes Tribunal was meeting in Berlin, but was going to move to Nuremberg as soon as I could get things ready there. The street was still blocked by rubble here and there. It was being cleared away by German prisoners of war, who labored, as it happened, under the smoldering gazes of black American military policemen. The American Army was still segregated in those days. Every unit was all black or all white, except for the officers, who were usually white in any case. I do not recall having felt that there was anything odd in this scheme. I knew nothing about black people. There had been no black people on the household staff of the McCone Mansion in Cleveland. No black people in my schools. Not even when I was a communist had I had a black person for a friend. Near St. Martha's Church on the Königstrasse, which had had its roof burned off by a firebomb, my Mercedes was halted at a security checkpoint. It was manned by white American military police. They were looking for people who were not where they were supposed to be, now that civilization was being started up again. They were seeking deserters from every imaginable army, including the American one, and war criminals not yet apprehended, and lunatics and common criminals who had simply sauntered from the approaching front lines, and citizens of the Soviet Union who had defected to the Germans or been captured by them, who would be imprisoned or killed if they went back home. Russians were supposed, no matter what, to go back to Russia. Poles were supposed to go back to Poland, Hungarians to Hungary, Estonians to Estonia, and on and on. Everybody, no matter what, was supposed to go home. I was curious as to what sort of interpreters the MPs were using, since I was having trouble finding good ones for my own operations. I particularly needed people who were trilingual, who were fluent in both German and English, and in either French or Russian as well. They also had to be trustworthy, polite, and presentable. So I got out of my car to have a closer look at the interrogations. I discovered that they were being conducted, surprisingly, by a seeming gypsy boy. It was my Ruth, of course. Her hair had all been cut off at a delousing station. She was wearing army fatigues without any badges of unit or rank. She was beautiful to watch as she tried to elicit a glimmer of understanding from a ragbag of a man whom the MPs held before her. She must have tried 7 or 8 languages on him, slipping from one to another as easily as a musician changing tempos and keys. Not only that, but she altered her gestures too, so that her hands were always doing appropriate dances to each language. Suddenly, the man's hands were dancing as hers were, and the sounds coming from his mouth were like those she were making. As Ruth would tell me later, he was a Macedonian peasant from southern Yugoslavia. The language they had found in common was Bulgarian. He had been taken prisoner by the Germans, even though he had never been a soldier, and had been sent as a slave laborer to strengthen the forts of the Siegfried Line. He had never learned German. Now he wanted to go to America, he told Ruth, to become a very rich man. He was shipped back to Macedonia, I presume. Ruth was then 26 years old, but she had eaten so bad for 7 years, mostly potatoes and turnips, that she was an asexual stick. She herself, it turned out, had come to the roadblock only an hour before I had, and had been pressed into service by the MPs because of all the languages she knew. I asked an MP sergeant how old he thought she was, and he guessed 15. He thought she was a boy whose voice had yet to change. I coaxed her into the back seat of my Mercedes, and I questioned her there. I learned that she had been freed from a concentration camp in springtime, about 4 months before, and had since eluded every agency that might have liked to help her. She should by now have been in a hospital for displaced persons. She was uninterested in ever trusting anybody with her destiny anymore. Her plan was to roam alone and out of doors forever, from nowhere to nowhere, in a demented sort of religious ecstasy. "No one ever touches me," she said, "and I never touch anyone. I am like a bird in flight. It is so beautiful. There is only God and me." I thought this of her, that she resembled gentle Ophelia in Hamlet, who became fey and lyrical when life was too cruel to bear. I have a copy of Hamlet at hand, and refresh my memory as to the nonsense Ophelia sang when she would no longer respond intelligently to those who asked how she was. This was the song. "How should I your true love know from another one, by his cockle hat and staff, and his sandal shoon? He is dead and gone, lady, he is dead and gone. At his head a grass-green turf, at his heels a stone." And on and on. Ruth, one of millions of Europe's Ophelias after the Second World War, fainted in my motor car. I took her to a 20-bed hospital in the Kaiserberg, the imperial castle, which wasn't even officially operating yet. It was being set up exclusively for persons associated with the war crimes trials. The head of it was a Harvard classmate of mine, Dr. Ben Shapiro, who had also been a communist in student days. He was now a lieutenant colonel in the Army Medical Corps. Jews were not numerous at Harvard in my day. There was a strict quota, and a low one, as to how many Jews were let in each year. "What have we here, Walter?" he said to me in Nuremberg. I was carrying the unconscious Ruth in my arms. She weighed no more than a handkerchief. "It's a girl," I said. "She's breathing. She speaks many languages. She fainted. That's all I know." He had an idle staff of nurses, cooks, technicians, and so on, and the finest food and medicines that the Army could give him, since he was likely to have high-ranking persons for patients by and by. So Ruth received, and for nothing, the finest care available on the planet. Why? Mostly because, I think, Shapiro and I were both Harvard men. 1 year later, more or less, on October 15th, 1946, Ruth would become my wife. The war crimes trials were over. On the day we were married, we probably conceived our only child as well. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering cheated the hangman by swallowing cyanide. It was vitamins and minerals and protein and, of course, tender loving care that made all the difference to Ruth. After only 3 weeks in the hospital, she was a sane and witty Viennese intellectual. I hired her as my personal interpreter and took her everywhere with me. Through another Harvard acquaintance, a shady colonel in the quartermaster corps in Wiesbaden, a black marketeer, I'm sure, I was able to get her a suitable wardrobe, for which, mysteriously, I was never asked to pay anyone. The woolens were from Scotland, the cottons from Egypt, the silks from China, I suppose. The shoes were French and pre-war. One pair, I remember, was alligator and came with a bag to match. The goods were priceless, since no store in Europe, or in North America for that matter, had offered anything like them for years. The sizes, moreover, were exactly right for Ruth. These black market treasures were delivered to my office in cartons claiming to contain mimeograph paper belonging to the Royal Canadian Air Force. 2 taciturn young male citizens delivered them in what had once been a Wehrmacht ambulance. Ruth guessed that one was Belgian, and the other, like my mother, Lithuanian. My accepting those goods was surely my most corrupt act as a public servant, and my only corrupt act, until Watergate. I did it for love. I began to speak to Ruth of love almost as soon as she got out of the hospital and went to work for me. Her replies were kind of funny and perceptive, but above all pessimistic. She believed, and was entitled to believe, I must say, that all human beings were evil by nature, whether tormentors or victims or idle standers-by. They could only create meaningless tragedies, she said, since they weren't nearly intelligent enough to accomplish all the good they meant to do. We were a disease, she said, which had evolved on one tiny cinder in the universe, but could spread and spread. "How can you speak of love to a woman," she asked me early in our courtship, "who feels that it would be just as well if nobody had babies anymore, if the human race did not go on?" "Because I know you really don't believe that," I replied. "Ruth, look at how full of life you are." It was true. There was no movement or sound she made that was not at least accidentally flirtatious. And what is flirtatiousness but an argument that life must go on and on and on? What a charmer she was. Oh, I got the credit for how smoothly things ran. My own country gave me a Distinguished Service Medal, and France made me a Chevalier in the Légion d'Honneur, and Great Britain and the Soviet Union sent me letters of commendation and thanks. But it was Ruth who worked all the miracles, who kept each guest in a state of delighted forgivingness, no matter what went wrong. "How can you dislike life and still be so lively?" I asked her. "I couldn't have a child, even if I wanted to," she said. "That's how lively I am." She was wrong about that, of course. She was only guessing. She would give birth to a son by and by. A very unpleasant person who, as I have already said, is now a book reviewer for the New York Times. That conversation with Ruth in Nuremberg went on. We were in St. Martha's Church, close to where fate had brought us together. It was not yet operating as a church again. The roof had been put back on, but there was a canvas flap where the rose window used to be. The window and the altar, an old custodian told us, had been demolished by a single cannon shell from a British fighter plane. To him, judging from his solemnity, this was yet another religious miracle. And I must say that I seldom met a male German who was saddened by all the destruction in his own country. It was always the ballistics of whatever had done the wrecking that he wished to talk about. "There is more to life than having babies, Ruth," I said. "If I had one, it would be a monster," she said. And it came to pass. "Never mind babies," I said. "Think of the new era that is being born. The world has learned its lesson at last. At last. The closing chapter to 10,000 years of madness and greed is being written right here and now, in Nuremberg. Books will be written about it. Movies will be made about it. It's the most important turning point in history." I believed it. "Walter," she said, "sometimes I think you are only 8 years old." "It's the only age to be," I said, "when a new era is being born." Clocks struck 6 all over town. A new voice joined the chorus of public chimes and bells. It was, in fact, an old voice in Nuremberg, but Ruth and I had never heard it before. It was the deep bonging of the Männleinlaufen, the bizarre clock of the distant Frauenkirche. That clock was built more than 400 years ago. My ancestors, both Lithuanian and Polish, would have been fighting Ivan the Terrible back then. The visible part of the clock consisted of 7 robots, which represented 7 14th-century electors. They were designed to circle an 8th robot, which represented the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. and to celebrate his exclusion in 1356 of the papacy from the selection of German rulers. The clock had been knocked out by bombing. American soldiers who were clever with machinery had begun on their own time to tinker with it as soon as they occupied the city. Most Germans I had talked to were so demoralized that they did not care if the Männlein Laufen never rang again. But it was running again anyway. Thanks to American ingenuity, the electors were circling Charles IV again. "Well," said Ruth, when the sounds of the bells had died away, "when you 8-year-olds kill evil here in Nuremberg, be sure to bury it at a crossroads and drive a stake through its heart, or you just might see it again at the next full moon."